Welcome to the Book Fair Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. I'm Anthony, and this week, a debut young adult novel by playwright and screenwriter Moira Buffini, an author accused of plagiarism, and a neurological study on the differences between reading off of a page or a screen, along with an interview featuring Rosanne Parry, author of A Horse Named Sky and the Voice of the Wilderness series. We'll begin our headlines with this article from The Telegraph. Anti-racism author accused of plagiarizing ethnic minority academics. Robin DiAngelo alleged to have copied parts of doctoral thesis from Asian American scholars. The best-selling author of a book about white fragility has been accused of plagiarizing sections of the work of two Asian Americans in her doctoral thesis. Robin DiAngelo, an anti-racism consultant who argues that racial divisions have been entrenched by defensive white people, committed 20 cases of plagiarism according to a complaint filed with her alma mater, the University of Washington. Miss DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, became a New York Times bestseller when it was published in 2018 and also experienced a surge in popularity following the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. The 67-year-old has previously written about the importance of properly attributing the work of ethnic minority writers in a section on her website about how white people must continually educate themselves on race. Her thesis allegedly lifts 2 paragraphs from Thomas Nakayama, an Asian American professor with Northeastern University, and his co-author Robert Krizek, without attribution. In making its case, the newspaper published large excerpts from her work alongside the text she is accused of copying, with the similarities highlighted in red. In one section, Professor Nakayama and Professor Krizek wrote, "With this discourse recognizes a part of its historical constitution, this reflexivity does not necessarily mean that there has been a recognition of the power relations embedded in that history." Similarly, Ms. DiAngelo wrote in her 2004 thesis, "While this discourse recognizes in part a historical constitution, this does not necessarily indicate that there is a recognition of the power relations embedded in that history." Her Whiteness in Racial Dialogue dissertation is also reported to have lifted material from Stacy Lee, an Asian American professor of education, summarizing the work of a third scholar. Professor Lee wrote that David Theo Goldberg argues the questions surrounding racial discourse should focus not so much on how true stereotypes are, but on how the truth claims they offer are a part of a larger worldview, and what forms of action that worldview authorizes. Ms. DiAngelo wrote, "Goldberg argues that the questions surrounding racial discourse should not focus on how true stereotypes are, but how the truth claims they offer are a part of a larger worldview that authorizes." Now, what this article is laying out is pretty blatant examples of suspected plagiarism where DiAngelo may have been lifting sections of other writings and passing them off as her own, which is what plagiarism is defined as, passing something as your own when it is a pre-written work. The important thing here is if you are working in a field, or if you are studying, or if you're in school and you're writing something, always make sure to include citations to any material that you are copying or even summarizing. Not even if it's just verbatim written down. Make sure that you put your sources so that this kind of stuff doesn't come back to bite you. Next, from Publishers Weekly, major publishers, Authors Guild, sue over new Florida book banning law. In what may be to turn out to be one of the most consequential lawsuits yet filed in defense of the freedom to read, 6 major publishers, the Authors Guild, and several best-selling authors have teamed up with students and parents in Florida to file a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of 2 provisions of the state's recently enacted HB 1069. The complaint argues that the vague and overbroad statute has led to the improper removal of hundreds of books from school and classroom libraries in the state. Authors signed on to the suit include Julia Alvarez, Laurie House Anderson, John Green, Jodi Picoult, and Angie Thomas. Specifically, the August 29th complaint challenges two parts of Section 1006.28 of the law. One that broadly prohibits books in public schools that contain any content that, quote, describes sexual conduct, end quote, and another that bans books that contain allegedly pornographic content, quote, without consideration of the book as a whole, as the Supreme Court requires, end quote. The suit was filed in the Middle District of Florida in Orlando with all of the Big Five publishers, Hachette, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Penguin Random House, and Simon & Schuster, along with Source Books, a majority of which is owned by PRH, but which operates independently, signing on as plaintiffs. Quote, House Bill 1069 violates the First Amendment rights of publishers, authors, and students by forcing teachers, media specialists, and their school districts to remove books or face penalties, including loss of licensure, end quote. The complaint states, quote, the publisher plaintiffs and the author plaintiffs have the First Amendment rights to disseminate and have read the constitutionally protected books, and the student plaintiffs have the First Amendment right to receive and read constitutionally protected books, free from unconstitutional content-based restrictions mandated by the state of Florida. Plaintiffs bring this action to safeguard their fundamental rights and the rights of others under the First Amendment. The lawsuit seeks two declaratory judgments from the court. The first is that HB 1069's prohibition on content that describes sexual content, which applies to K through 12, is overbroad and thus unconstitutional. The second is that the law's vague term pornographic in section 1006.28 is either synonymous with the harmful to minors standard defined by Florida law, which is apparently grounded in the Supreme Court's standard for obscenity set forth in Miller v. California, or, if that's not the case, a ruling that the law's undefined prohibition of pornographic content is unconstitutional. The suit does not challenge any other provisions of the law nor the state's previous harmful to minors standard. Jumping down to the end of the article here, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed HB 1069 into law in May 2023 as part of a suite of bills that defined his so-called Let Kids Be Kids agenda. But critics of the law say that its vague language has led to widespread book banning in schools statewide. The suit comes after a group of parents and Florida public school students, along with the ACLU, filed a suit in June alleging that the law's content review procedure discriminate against parents who oppose book bans and censorship. It is one of several by publishers now pending in federal court, including challenges in Arkansas, Iowa, Texas, and in Escambia County, Florida. Quote, as publishers dedicated to protecting freedom of expression and the right to read, the rise in book bans across the country continues to demand our collective action, the 6 attached publishers said in a joint statement. Quote, fighting unconstitutional legislation in Florida and across the country is an urgent priority. We are unwavering in our support of educators, librarians, students, authors, readers. Everyone deserves access to books and stories that show different perspectives and viewpoints. I do very much encourage you to check the resources listed in the podcast description, as this article on Publishers Weekly website does link to several other sources that will help you get a better understanding of the battle against book censorship. One last article for today. Medium Matters. How children's brains handle reading from page versus screen. As a team of educational neuroscience researchers, Karen Froud, Lisa Levinson, Charlie Maddox, and Paul Smith explore the intricate workings of the brain. Among them, they have decades of experience in experimental neuroscience investigating the brain, language, and literacy. Their work is conducted in the Neurocognition of Language Lab, a brain imaging research facility in the Department of Biobehavioral Sciences at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Froud is the lab director and associate professor of neuroscience and education. Dr. Levinson is a lecturer and a senior research scientist in the lab. Dr. Maddox is a senior research associate, and Smith is a PhD student and lab manager. Shively is a freelance journalist and producer who provided editorial support for this article. We asked the team to share their recent findings on the neurological differences in children when reading in print versus on a digital screen and the implications for early literacy. In a recent study published in PLOS ONE, our team investigated brain-level differences in children when reading in print versus on a digital screen. Our study was the first to use event-related potentials, a way of measuring brain activity to see how children responded to the relatedness of words in a passage of text. Our findings suggested that reading from a page leads to a deeper engagement with the text's meaning than reading from a screen. As the debate over print versus digital reading continues, our study offers new insights into how the reading medium can influence engagement with text. Our study participants were middle schoolers aged 10 to 12 years, all reading on grade level. We developed tightly controlled text passages that matched one another on sentence structure and length, complexity of ideas, vocabulary number of concepts, and more. During the study, we monitored the children's brain activity as they read these passages on a screen or in print. After each passage, we presented them with words and asked them to indicate whether each one was related or unrelated to what they had just read. This task allowed us to evaluate how well the children's brains had formed meaning networks for the text. Words varied in their relation to the text. Some were very closely related. Some were completely unrelated. We were most interested in how readers' brains would handle in between words that were sort of related, like club or score after reading about chess. These are words where you can see a connection, but perhaps not immediately. These findings provide new scientific evidence that our brains process information differently depending on whether we read from paper or screens. Reading from paper seems to encourage deeper understanding and more robust encoding of meanings compared to reading digitally. So should we throw our screens away? We'd argue not. Although deep encoding of information is valuable, it's not always what is needed. In today's age of information overload, children need to be prepared to selectively and flexibly dig deeply into some texts and commit parts to memory. But with other texts, they might need to engage in quick, shallow reading to identify themes, determine relevance, and evaluate whether more attention is warranted. These different skills could be relevant for different mediums. In addition, our study was only the first of many that need doing. On screens, children can usually change font size, contrast, click on links, engage with text in new ways. Does greater interactivity compensate for the indices of shallower processing that showed up in our study? We need to investigate that. Screens might be helpful for students with reading difficulties or with attention problems because they offer that kind of adaptability. I'll go ahead and stop reading there. I'll link the Publishers Weekly article as well as the original study in the podcast description. I'm a big advocate for reading on e-readers because you can change the font size as needed, and that's something that I actually talked about with today's guest, Rosanne Parry, coming up in just a second. Next, let's take a look at some recent releases coming out this week. The first of which is The Daggers of Ire by J.C. Cervantes. All the brujes of the city of San Bosco have a magical specialty that involves dominion over one of four elements: fire, earth, water, and air. All except 12-year-old Esmeralda Santos. She's secretly a witch of chaos, an element considered illegal by a magical society. Following her mother's death in an accident, Esme is desperate to help her father, who has since curled up into a ball of grief. She soon finds a spell to render a heart full again, but before she can cast it, all the other witches of San Bosco suddenly disappear. At her older sister's final behest before vanishing, Esme and her involuntarily shape-shifting friend embark on a quest to find one of San Bosco's original witches, whom no one has seen in a century. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. The next new release is Luminous Beings by David Arnold and illustrated by Jose Pimienta. Almost a year ago, best friends Ty and Berger made a pact to take a gap year and then apply to film school together. But that was before the appearance of zombie squirrels. Now the budding artists scrap together documentary footage of their dystopian present using their phones, work at Costeur's Coffee with their friend Miles, and puzzle over the disappearance of the cafe's former owner, Stuart Fink. After the crew, plus Miles's partner Fib, uncover an unsent email from Fink that implies he's still alive, they decide to track him down to earn the $20,000 reward his parents are offering. The ensuing all-nighter leads the teens to Club Quarantine, a millionaire's castle in the middle of the woods, and leaves them with a deeper appreciation for their friendship, and some excellent footage for their film. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. And the final new release to highlight this week is Songlight by Moira Buffini. In the oppressive patriarchal theocracy of Brightland, which is at war, officials intend to exterminate unhumans who have access to powerful telepathic abilities called Songlight. 18-year-old Elsa and her secret boyfriend Rye live in coastal moorland village North Haven, constantly fearing being outed as unhuman. Rye's looming deployment to the war front and Elsa's impending marriage to a returning veteran complicate matters further. After Rye is jailed by Elsa's older brother, Elsa makes chance contact through Songlight with 17-year-old Kara, who lives in the capital city of Brightlingham. Though the girls find solace in each other's company, their burgeoning power attracts the attention of human supremacist faction leaders who seek to escalate the war using forbidden technology and manipulative Songlight abilities. In this stunning YA debut, play and screenwriter Buffini expertly juggles a complex plot via 5 distinct perspectives. By playing off conflicting internal motivations to explore weighty topics of reproductive freedom, internalized homophobia, and state oppression, Buffini casts a nuanced adventure, all the while dropping tantalizing hints of further conflict and hidden history broiling under the surface of this dystopian trilogy opener. This book is recommended for ages 13 and up, and be on the lookout for an interview with Moira Buffini on this very podcast in the coming weeks. And finally, before we move on to the interview with Rosanne Parry, creator of the Voice of the Wilderness series, if you appreciate the work being done by the Book Fair, you can show your support in a number of ways, including simply leaving a review or a rating wherever you find your favorite podcasts. On Spotify, you can leave a star rating, and on iTunes, you can either leave a rating or write a review. Any amount of engagement does help. There are comments underneath podcast episodes on Spotify now, as well as a Q&A. And if you truly enjoy the podcast, the best way is simply by sharing the podcast with somebody in your life, either a teacher or a young reader. I do my best to make sure that these podcasts are engaging and family-friendly. Lastly, you can follow the podcast through social media, either on Facebook, Instagram, or on Threads. Simply look up Book Fair Pod. There is also a Patreon page where you can either follow for free or give a monthly recurring donation in order to help support the podcast. The Patreon will have all the resources as well as further research done for the podcast. You can also see updates of my personal life if you'd wish to do so. Now, let's move on to the interview with Rosanne Parry. Rosanne Parry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, thank you.
And to start off our interview, would you like to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Rosanne Parry, and I am the author of these Voice of the Wilderness books. it's a group of related books that are all narrated by a wild animal. The first of them is A Wolf Called Wander, and then there's which is about wolves. Whale of the Wild is about orcas in the Salish Sea, and then this book that we're talking about today, A Horse Named Sky, is about mustangs, and it is set in northwestern Nevada and California, and during the time of the Pony Express. So,
and when it comes to writing these books, particularly with A Horse Named Sky, what kind of research goes into writing about these characters?
I love to learn new things. It's one of my favorite parts about writing is learning things about animals and habitats, and so although I read a lot and there's plenty of documentaries that I watch when I'm researching, what I really love is both to talk to people who are experts in my subject, and also to actually get out there in the wilderness and do some hands-on research. So I've been to the Virginia Range a number of times and hiked around and looked at the horses there and the habitat. And because the story involves the Pony Express a little bit, I've also, the run that my horse takes in the story is the station that starts at Lake Tahoe and goes up over Echo Summit of the Sierra Nevadas and ends at Strawberry Station, which is the highest elevation Pony Express station. And so that trail, though, the Pony Express Trail, is a hiking trail that anybody can walk on, which is fabulous. It crosses the Pacific Crest Trail right there at Echo Summit. And so my family and I hiked up there one summer, which was amazing and beautiful. And then there's also quite a few wild horses in eastern Oregon. In the Steens Mountain Wilderness area, there are hundreds of wild horses, and they've been there for centuries, really. And boy, but you got to get way out there to see them, man. It's 50 miles from a gas station. So, but it's beautiful out there, and just the ability to, like, I go in my research van and we found a place to park that was a couple hundred yards off of a water hole, and just to see that sun come up and those horses just coming out of the hills one by one, each band going down to the water to drink. Oh, it was amazing. So beautiful.
So in preparation, you're going on hiking trails, hanging out with wild horses. Do you have the coolest job in the world?
I think I do. I absolutely think I do.
I gotta say, just hearing about all those descriptions, I'm very, very jealous. And when it comes to writing, you mentioned that you're always learning new things. Do you feel that that is an important part of not just writing from these perspectives of wild animals, but also just writing in general?
Yeah, I think curiosity is maybe more important than talent when it comes to writing. I love to learn new things. I do, and so I'm always excited when I come across a cool, interesting fact. I was astonished to learn, for example, that during the ice ages in North America, the very last 1,000 feet of the Sierra Nevadas were never covered by those floes of ice, and so the wildflowers that grow on that last 1,000 feet, the most harsh climate up there in the Alpine zone, are the most ancient plants in North America. They're like the dinosaurs of the flower world because they were never scraped off by the glaciers, and so they're really old. Like, who knew? I had never even thought about that before. So I love coming across those little tidbits of interesting things
And you said something specifically there that I thought was a very wonderful quote. You said, curiosity is more important than talent. So do you feel that the kind of that want to discover new information can lead to telling more interesting stories than just, say, like a latent ability to be able to weave these stories?
Yeah, and having a lively interest in things also gives you some staying power because nobody's first draft is brilliant, no matter how talented you are, right? And so, but curiosity is what helps you, I think, hang in there for the longer haul of doing all the revising that you need to, right? And so I find that curiosity serves me better than just thinking, oh, I'm talented enough to do this, or worrying, ooh, am I not talented enough to do this, right? That curiosity, that determination, in the end, matters a lot more, right? I'm good not because I was born with some innate talent to write. I'm good at it because I practice it all the time, and I love practicing.
So on top of reading and writing and doing all this research, you also lead writing workshops both for students and for adults. How is your approach different in leading workshops for young writers as opposed to older writers?
The material actually is seldom very different. What I find different about younger writers is they're a lot braver on the page than older writers, in part because they don't know how hard it's going to be, and so they'll try anything. And kids are more willing to play with a thing on the page. And so I enjoy that very much about readers, about young readers. I think what they need is not something simplified so much as they need context, both for what they're reading and in their writing, right? So lots of times kids who are reading my books, this might be the first animal point of view book they've ever read, right? This one is set during the American Civil War. For a lot of readers who are 8 or 9 or 10 years old, it's likely the very first Civil War story they've ever read, right? So I'm aware of that and building in context for young readers and young writers, but the actual content, by the time they are 10 or 11 years old, they can understand pretty much everything adults can understand.
Yes, I always say that children are a lot smarter than most people are willing to give them credit for. And we did talk a little bit before we started recording about exposing children to literature and the arts at an early age. And I really love to hear that from you as someone who leads these workshops. Do you find that these children, as you said, they're able to understand these writing concepts and they have a vague idea of what they want to write about? Do you find that when you're presenting them with these ideas of, well, it's a book about an animal, but the animal can talk to other animals, do you feel that they are able to just kind of readily grasp onto these ideas a little bit more easily than an adult reader would?
I think young readers they're not as jaded as adult readers sometimes, right? Because they haven't read 10 other books like this. They've maybe only read 10 or 12 other books total by the time they're coming to my book. So a lot of it is really fresh to them, which is nice. But I love what good writing does for them in terms of opening up their imagination and encouraging them to try a thing. Because kids are pretty close to nature, lots of kids will send me little stories or anecdotes that they write about, like their pets, right? Because they're down there on the floor with those pets every day. And they are thinking about, oh, what is the world like for my cat or my dog? And since they're lying right down there on the floor with them, they have a better sense of maybe what the world seems like to them, right? And children have some vulnerabilities that are similar to animals' vulnerabilities in the world. And so I think they're also sort of naturally empathetic with that. But I also wanted to say, while we're talking about the arts, I am so grateful for the illustrator of this book. Her name is Kirby Fagan, and she did a fabulous job with all of these illustrations. Horses are not easy to draw. And if you get it a little bit wrong, it seems way off to people when they see it. And
I have heard a famous anecdote that I don't think is true about the author of Where the Wild Things Are, saying he was writing a book called Where the Wild Horses Are, but discovered that he didn't know how to draw a horse. I want to believe that, but I don't know how true it is, because it's just one of those kinds of stories.
I think horses are really hard to draw. And so most illustrators are either good at drawing horses or good at drawing people. But getting an illustrator who can draw both horses and people is quite the challenge. But I think Kirby did a fabulous job. They just look.
The illustrations in the book are very beautiful. And so when you're talking about these being within the first dozen or so books a young reader will experience, do you feel that there's a responsibility to make the books interesting and engaging in order to maintain young readers as an audience?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I used to be a teacher myself, and reading was my specialty. And so I do have a special place in my heart for that, fidgeting window watcher in the back row of the classroom who's like, I dare you to write something that's good enough to capture my attention, right? So I know on a sentence by sentence level what makes reading easier and harder for kids, right? So I don't ever want to dumb down the reading, but I do keep some, basic things in mind. Like if it's going to be a hard word, I'm going to put it in the easiest sentence I can make, right? One of the things that I love about animals is that they're pretty straightforward, right? They don't, and direct in their thinking. And so, and then I'm also grateful to my publisher, HarperCollins, who also think a lot about what makes reading easy and hard for young readers. And so they set up a page that's really welcoming, that has enough space on it, that has a really easy to follow font, room enough so you can follow along with your finger. All of those things work together in one package with the illustrations to make it a book that a kid can just open any page of the book and go, yep, I can do this. This is welcoming. Because some books, if they open up that page and the text is so crowded or the font is hard to read, they just look at it and go, nope, this book is not for me. And then it doesn't matter how good the writing is. If they're defeated at the level of the page, then they're not going to read it. And so I'm grateful kind of for the whole publishing team that really takes that young reader to heart and goes, how can we make this?
And all that about formatting is something that a lot of writers typically don't consider. So with a younger audience specifically, you're looking at spacing the lines a little bit to make following along easier. You're maybe considering illustrations on the page. And it's all part of just engaging the reader. Because even I, as an adult with ADHD, if I see a book where a paragraph takes up an entire page, I take a break from that book for a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't have ADHD, but I do often lose my place when I'm reading. And so I'm pretty sensitive to that sort of thing myself. I have, tricks I've learned over the years to help that be better. But yeah, I want it to be the most inviting experience for a young reader. And I also want to make sure that it sounds good out loud, because not every good book sounds good out loud. But because my readers are in that reading out loud phase of their life, I really want it to be a rewarding experience for the family or the classroom teacher who decides.
Yes, it's easy to kind of get lost in the prose and, making sentences that feel natural to read silently, but if it's something that's read out loud, it becomes a little clunky, and that's something that I think makes books for young audiences a lot more approachable, even for adults with ADHD, because most adults read at about a 6th grade level anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Having prose on a book that reads naturally the way that can be spoken out loud can help with following it along. And that's all just a part of what makes it something kind of having to like cater to the audience without talking down to them. We've all seen material that's talking down to the audience. And as an adult looking at those, I'm offended on the child's behalf.
Wait a minute. What's going on here? Yeah.
And so, so circling back to writing workshops and the way that you handle talking about writing with young readers, what kind of challenges do you have as a writer? And do you talk about this at all in the workshops? What kind of challenges do you have writing from non-human character point of view?
Well, when I'm thinking about an animal character, I need to know a lot about that animal. But one of the reasons I go to the ecosystems where these animals live is so that I can know not just about that animal, but also the world the animal exists in. What can they hear? What can they smell? When I was out on the range I was astonished by how many different kinds of grass there are. And there's like 100 different kinds of flowers. There's like 100 different kinds of bees on that high prairie in Eastern Oregon. And I'm looking around and I'm looking at all these different flowers going, gosh, I wonder if they all taste the same. So I just went around and tasted a bunch of them. And as it turns out, flowers do not taste the same. I had no idea, right? So, but I tasted them, and some of them taste sweet, and some of them are really like sour and lemony, and there are some that are peppery and some that are bitter. But I mean, how would I know unless I was there? But the taste of that's a big part of a horse's life. They spend a lot of time grazing. And so, really getting out there and going, what does this environment, what does this ground feel like under my feet? Right.
I want you to know I wasn't cracking up specifically because you said you tasted the flower, but because I was actually going to bring up that exact passage from the book, because I was just thinking about how an animal would perceive the world, specifically in a horse named Sky. Sky spent some time discussing the different colored flowers and how they taste differently from each other.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't have known to include that if I hadn't tasted them. I never would have, because I would have assumed that they all taste the same. Why would they taste different? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's definitely something interesting. Because yes, it is. It's how the animal perceives the world, and to kind of ascribe a more human affectation to it. That's just basically what. That is what basic empathy is. At the end of the day, is putting yourself in a character's perspective. So really opening up a book to, and the way a book is written to put the reader in the shoes of a character, literally with this case of A Horse Named Sky, where you're really seeing the world how a horse would, as opposed to seeing it in the context of a person. You're thinking, oh, this is just an empty field, whereas a horse would say, well, there's all these flowers here, and this is where the creek runs, and now the creek has gone dry, and we got to go find where the water is. And so that's one of those core tools of empathy that young readers have to, it's a muscle you have to stretch, really.
Yeah, and I love that for all books really are an invitation to empathy, to look at the world through another character's eyes. It's one of the reasons why I think diversity is so important in children's literature, and why it's so distressing that there's this pushback against diverse literature for children, right? It's why we really need to resist censorship as much as we can. And I got to say, that is absolutely a local game. Your best bet for fighting that censorship is right in your own school district, in your own library community.
Believe me, I'm in Texas. I'm well aware. In fact, over the summer, I did an episode for the podcast rounding up every single censorship law that was passed from state legislatures as the session wrapped up over March to May. And there were a lot. And there were very few positive stories. I think two states codified the right to access literature in their state laws, and the rest just had dozens of bills proposed for redefining obscenity laws and giving the school board and more power over what's in the classrooms rather than the teachers and the librarians. Is there anything that you can give perspective on that as a former teacher?
Well, I would say that there are people who will try to censor books, but to actually remove them from a community is difficult, right? Because libraries are an excellent defense. I think independent bookstores are definitely in the game. I know that I believe it's the New York Public Library will give a free library card to anybody. I think they have to be 14, I think. But you can get a free library card and check out electronically any book from that system. So there are some ways around the censorship that's being put forward. But speaking up and speaking out about it really matters. And for a lot of young people, this is their first taste of being active politically, and their voices matter in that conversation. And so I'm always talking to one of the things that I really stress when I'm in a writing workshop with young writers is how much power there is in being able to write. Most of the kids I do a workshop for are not going to become authors themselves, but everybody has more power if they are able to write clearly and persuasively. And an excellent example of that is in 1973, the Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Protection Act. It was part of that group of legislation that happened in the early 70s, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, right? The Wild Horse Act followed after that. But that was a law that had no adult constituency. There was just this one woman from the Virginia range of Nevada who saw horses being hunted for sport and said, "That's just wrong. It's just wrong." And she wrote editorials to her newspaper about it. But the only people who seemed to care were children. So she went from one school to the next to talk about the plight of wild horses to school children. And they wrote letters to their congressperson, their governors, the Department of the Interior, asking for protection for wild horses. And it is the only law I know of that was passed almost entirely on the advocacy of children. And so now it is against the law to hunt wild horses, right? That's power. That's real power. And I want young readers and young writers to grasp that is, boy, before you can vote, writing is the most power you can have as a young person. And so I want them to feel that power and to use it wisely.
And it's not just writing. It starts with reading, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I always talk about this a lot, but when you take a group of students to the library for class and you say, go pick out a book, that's probably one of the first times in their lives that they are given agency over what to do with their time. They get to choose what to read. They can find what interests them. And they may have issues with reading. They may have trouble with comprehension, and it may be a challenge for them, but giving them the chance to pick out a book on their own for the first time. And if they're in the third grade and they're picking up a book for first graders and they're reading below their grade level, at least they're choosing to read something. And that power of the written word really does start at giving children the choice to read what interests them.
Yeah, and I think even for that kid who's picking the easier book, reading is a muscle, man, and that tracking the print across the page, that's a physical skill more than an intellectual skill, right? And you build it by repetitions like any other exercise. And so it just takes a lot of practice to read fluently. And so that's why I think graphic novels and those easy readers are fine for kids, because they have to put the time in with their eyes on the page to be able to read fluently. And right. Any book that gets their eyes on the page regularly is going to build that reading muscle.
And you can always put a video lecture in front of a child and you can do a recap after, and they will have absorbed something. But when it comes to reading, the child has to engage with it. They can't just stare at a page and absorb information. They have to read it and process the information. And that's kind of one of the things that makes it so different, is that it's not a form of medium that is going to come to them. So having access to it is really important. And there's all kinds of new technology that makes it more accessible and easier. I have a Kindle right here. Sometimes if I'm having a hard time focusing, I'll blow up the font and I'll increase the spacing and it'll make it easier for me to read. And those are the kind of tools that are just so invaluable, that I think that more people should be aware of. Is that, there are physical books, but there's also ebooks and audiobooks, all these different ways to engage with stories to meet you at your level. Like, they're trying real hard to make it so easy for people. That's what I love about just, and I always say, media or entertainment or theater or literature for young audiences as opposed to children's books, because there's always this idea that something made for children is less than, but there's so much responsibility when it comes to targeting a young audience, because you are teaching empathy, you are teaching basic comprehension skills and how to engage with art critically. And that's something that a lot of adult, quote unquote, adult literature kind of takes for granted. They assume that a person reading a book already knows how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say too, children's books, as I understand the publishing industry, the editing of children's books is a far more intensive process than it is for adult books, because my publisher is keenly aware that these books are being used in a school. And so if I'm presenting this as the real life of a horse, they want to see all of my research. I send them every book, every documentary that I look at. If they see something and they're like, is that really true? They'll go and look, and they need to find some other source besides the source that I told them about. And if they can't find a second source for something that I've put forward as true in the book, they're like, show me another source, or it can't be in the book. You know, if you say a thing is true, it better be true. And that kind of fact-checking, I think, does not go on in adult books in the same way. And it's important, because I think children are still discerning what piece of this fiction is fact and what is truthful and what is imaginary, right? And so it's important to have that clarity for my readers. And I'm super grateful that that they give me some space in the back for nonfiction back matter, so I can give a little bit more context for some of the things that have happened in the book. So,
well, Rosanne, unfortunately, this is wrapping up our time. I do like to close out the interview with the same question for every author, and take as much time to answer this question and answer in any way you like.
Okay.
How do you describe yourself and the work that you do as an author?
I like to think of my work as an invitation to the imagination of my reader. I like to think of it as a door into the whole world of literature, right? Because for plenty of my readers, this is the first novel they've ever read. And that is a huge gift and a huge responsibility. And reading makes the life of a reader so much bigger that I often think of myself, I get up and I sit down at my desk and I just imagine an opening door. Because that's what I want for my readers, is to have those doors to walk through their whole life long.
And that has been an interview with Rosanne Parry, author of A Horse Named Sky and Voice of the Wilderness series. She is very passionate and a very wonderful person to talk to. You can find out more about her work in the podcast description. That is going to wrap up another episode of the Book Fair Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.